Blood is not always thicker than water. Sometimes it is the most toxic acid of all, quietly and systematically corroding the sturdiest foundations of trust until nothing remains but dust. The wind whipping through the manicured streets of their upscale neighborhood carried the bitter bite of early winter. The temperature had plummeted to 34 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the autumn rain into a cruel, stinging sleet. Eleanor Vance stood on the front porch of the sprawling colonial home she and her husband had built from the ground up. She was 68 years old. Her silver hair was pinned back neatly, defying the howling wind. Her weathered hands, permanently calloused from decades of relentless manual labor, gripped a brass key. She pushed the key into the lock. It did not turn. Eleanor tried again, her movements deliberate and calm. The tumblers had been changed. She withdrew the key and looked through the glass pane of the front door. Standing in the warmly lit foyer, completely shielded from the freezing rain, was her son. Julian Vance was 42 years old, dressed in a tailored wool suit that cost more than his parents used to make in a month. He watched her struggle with the lock, his face a mask of absolute indifference. Beside him stood his wife, Beatrice, sipping from a steaming porcelain mug, a faint smirk playing on her lips. The heavy oak door finally opened, but only a few inches. Julian did not invite them inside. Instead, he shoved a black plastic trash bag through the narrow gap. It hit the frozen wooden porch with a dull thud. "It is just some old clothes," Julian said, his voice completely devoid of warmth. "Everything else belongs to the estate now. You need to leave before I call the authorities." Eleanor did not flinch. She simply looked at the son she had carried, nurtured, and bled for. For 45 years, Eleanor and Silas Vance had lived a life defined by the brutal, unforgiving rhythm of the baker's clock. Every single morning, long before the sun had even considered cresting the horizon, they were elbow-deep in flour and yeast. They had endured the blistering heat of commercial ovens reaching 400 degrees Fahrenheit, the aching joints and the endless exhaustion. They had worked 14 hours a day, 7 days a week for decades. Every penny they saved, every sacrifice they made, was poured into building a humble corner bakery into a thriving family enterprise. Eventually, that enterprise grew into a beloved local chain worth exactly $1.4 million. They did not buy luxury cars. They did not take extravagant vacations to tropical islands. They took their life's work and funneled it directly into Julian's future. They paid every single cent of his exorbitant Ivy League tuition, ensuring he would never have to know the bone-deep weariness of manual labor. They had raised a financier, a man who understood markets and margins and legal loopholes. They had also raised a monster. The betrayal had not happened overnight. It was a slow, calculated execution. Julian had come to them months ago with a thick stack of legal documents, speaking in rapid, soothing tones about market volatility and the urgent need for tax optimization. He smiled that winning, boyish smile, assuring them signing a comprehensive power of attorney was merely a formality to protect their legacy. He had pointed to lines of dense legal text, promising it would secure their golden years. They had trusted him. They had signed away their entire existence. Armed with the absolute legal authority to act on their behalf, Julian quietly and ruthlessly liquidated everything. He sold the bakeries to a corporate conglomerate. He transferred the title of the colonial home into a holding company controlled entirely by Beatrice. He emptied their retirement accounts, transferring the funds into offshore trusts. When the final piece of the puzzle fell into place, he served his own parents with a formal eviction notice. "You have to understand the market realities, Mother," Julian had told her just yesterday, his tone condescending and flat. "You and Dad are not generating capital anymore. You are liabilities. Old people need to learn independence so they do not become a burden on the next generation." Now, standing in the freezing sleet, Eleanor stared at the black trash bag at her feet. Silas stood beside her. He was 72 years old. His left leg, shattered in a carpentry accident decades ago, throbbed with a dull agony in the cold, forcing him to lean heavily on his wooden cane. His face was pale, lined with a lifetime of honest work. He looked at his son, his eyes filled with a profound, quiet sorrow. But Eleanor did not cry. She did not scream. She did not fall on her knees and beg the boy she had raised to show them mercy. There were no hysterics, no pathetic pleas for justice. She simply reached out and placed her hand gently over Silas's trembling fingers. "Let us go, Silas," she said softly, her voice steady and rich with an unshakable dignity. She reached down, grabbed the plastic bag of discarded clothing, and turned her back on the house. She did not look back. She walked away with her head held high, leaning into the freezing wind, stepping carefully over the icy pavement. They had been stripped of their home, their savings, and their life's work. They had been cast out into the unforgiving winter by their own flesh and blood. Julian and Beatrice watched them walk away, convinced they had won the ultimate victory. They thought they had perfectly orchestrated the destruction of two old fools. They were wrong. The children thought they had stripped Eleanor of her entire life, taking everything of value and leaving behind only a hollow shell. But they didn't know that the only thing they couldn't steal from her was the very thing that was about to drag them straight down to hell. The 1998 Ford pickup truck offered very little protection against the bitter Kentucky winter. The heater had died 3 years ago, leaving the cab feeling like a steel icebox. It was perfectly quiet. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat, wrapping a frayed wool blanket around Silas's shivering shoulders. She reached into the glove compartment, feeling around in the darkness. Her fingers brushed against stale gum wrappers, old paper napkins, and a handful of loose coins. She gathered them into her palm and spread them out on her lap under the faint glow of a distant street lamp. She counted every single cent. They had a single $20 bill, a crumpled $5 bill, 2 $1 bills, and a pathetic assortment of tarnished quarters, dimes, and pennies. Their entire net worth was exactly $27.35. 45 years of backbreaking labor, of burning their arms on oven racks, of sacrificing sleep and comfort had been distilled down to this pitiful handful of metal and paper. Yet Eleanor's face remained entirely smooth, displaying no trace of despair. She carefully folded the bills, slipped them into her coat pocket, and closed her eyes. They slept in the freezing truck. Morning broke over the town of Whispering Pines in Owsley County with a pale, unforgiving light. The cold air bit at their faces as they walked toward the county courthouse. Silas leaned heavily on his cane, every step sending sharp spikes of pain up his ruined leg. Eleanor walked closely beside him, a silent pillar of strength. They needed shelter. They stood before the public bulletin board outside the courthouse doors. It was plastered with brightly colored flyers for missing dogs, local bake sales, and grim official notices of foreclosure. Eleanor's sharp eyes scanned the dense blocks of legal text. Her gaze stopped on a yellowed paper. It was a tax deed auction notice for a property listed simply as a condemned stone chapel. The structure, originally built in the mid-19th century, sat on a quarter-acre lot on the outskirts of town. It had been abandoned for decades, left to rot under the crushing weight of time and neglect. The county had finally condemned it, slating the ruined structure for total demolition. The auction was happening inside the courthouse in less than 10 minutes. The auction room was warm, filled with the smell of wet wool and stale coffee. A dozen local developers and property flippers sat in the wooden pews, chatting loudly. The county sheriff stood at the front of the room, acting as the auctioneer. He droned on, reading through a list of properties, occasionally striking his wooden gavel. "Next item," the sheriff announced, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "The condemned stone chapel on Old Mill Road. The structure is declared unsafe and must be demolished by the buyer. Bidding starts at the cost of the transfer fee." Silence filled the room. Not a single hand went up. The developers scoffed, whispering among themselves about the astronomical costs of tearing down solid stone walls and hauling away tons of debris. It was a worthless trap. It was garbage. Eleanor nudged Silas. Silas slowly raised his calloused hand into the air. $4, Silas said, his voice raspy but perfectly steady. The entire room turned to look at them. For a brief second, there was total silence. Then, the laughter started. It began as a low chuckle from a developer in the front row and quickly erupted into a chorus of cruel, mocking laughter. The well-dressed men and women pointed at the two older figures in their worn, dirty clothes. They laughed at the crippled old man and his quiet wife, buying a literal pile of rocks that would inevitably collapse on their heads. "Are you sure, old man?" the sheriff asked, shaking his head with a condescending smile. "You are buying a death trap." $4, Silas repeated, ignoring the insults swirling around him. "Going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman for $4, the sheriff declared, striking the gavel with a loud crack. More laughter followed them as Eleanor walked to the clerk's desk. She pulled out the crumpled $5 bill from her pocket and handed it over. She waited patiently, accepting her single dollar bill in change, along with a flimsy, tear-stained certificate of ownership. They were the laughingstock of Owsley County. But Eleanor did not care about the opinions of men who wore clean suits and soft hands. She possessed a patience that bordered on the eternal. She knew that real value was rarely visible on the surface. Leaving the courthouse, the freezing wind bit into their faces once again. Holding the torn $4 certificate, Eleanor stepped toward the outskirts of town to find the ruins of the chapel. Completely unaware, she was opening the door to a secret buried for 150 years. Old Mill Road ended in a choked path of overgrown briars and skeletal winter trees. At the dead end of the dirt trail, sitting on a slight rise of frozen earth, stood the ruined chapel. To the untrained eye, it was nothing more than a pathetic pile of hazardous rubble waiting to be swallowed by the earth. Half of the slate roof had completely collapsed inward, leaving the interior exposed to the harsh Kentucky elements for God knows how many decades. It looked completely dead. The smell of wet ash, decaying pine needles, and generations of accumulated bird droppings hung heavy in the freezing air. Thick vines, thick as a man's arm, crawled up the sides of the structure like parasitic serpents trying to drag the building down into the dirt. Shattered stained glass littered the ground, sparkling faintly in the pale winter light like broken teeth. Outsiders only saw garbage. They saw a financial black hole, a structural nightmare, and a pathetic joke bought by two senile fools for $4. But Silas Vance was not a financier who spent his life looking at numbers on a screen. He was a master carpenter, a man who had spent a half-century learning the secret language of wood, stone, and steel. He did not look at the decay, he looked at the bones. He limped forward slowly. His ruined leg dragged slightly across the frosted grass as he approached the towering front wall of the chapel. He reached out with a bare, heavily calloused hand and ran his fingers over the freezing, rough-hewn exterior. He pulled a heavy iron framing hammer from his deep coat pocket. He struck the wall. The sound did not produce a hollow, crumbling thud of decaying mortar or rotting brick. Instead, a sharp, ringing echo bounced off the stone, vibrating up Silas's arm with absolute, undeniable solidity. He struck it again, harder this time, listening closely to the deep resonance traveling through the structure. "Blue limestone," Silas murmured quietly, tracing the mortar lines. This was not modern, cheap construction, pieced together with flimsy timber and weak drywall. These walls were built before the American Civil War, constructed from massive blocks of pure blue limestone hauled out of the deep quarries by horse and wagon. The blocks were at least 2 feet thick, meticulously locked together by master stonemasons using gravity and friction, designed to withstand tornadoes, floods, and the endless march of time. The roof had failed, but the walls were eternal. While Silas inspected the perimeter, Eleanor moved quietly into the center of the devastated sanctuary. The floor was buried under 3 feet of collapsed roof timbers, shattered slate tiles, and frozen mounds of decaying leaves. She did not hesitate, she did not complain, and she did not ask for help. She simply dropped to her knees in the freezing dirt. She began to dig. Her bare hands, red and raw from the cold air, gripped the splintered ends of heavy pine boards, dragging them away one by one. She hauled broken slates, rusted iron nails, and piles of frozen muck out of the sanctuary, clearing a small circle in the very center of the room. It was exhausting, agonizing labor that would have broken a younger woman in 10 minutes. Eleanor did not stop. She worked in absolute silence for 2 solid hours, tearing away the accumulated rot of a century until her fingernails scraped against something incredibly hard. She brushed away the final layer of dirt, revealing a perfectly level, perfectly solid foundation of broad granite slabs. The foundation had not shifted a single inch in over 150 years. Then she saw the altar. It was buried beneath a massive, collapsed ceiling beam weighing at least 500 pounds, hidden entirely from the doorway. Silas saw her staring and slowly limped over to help her. Together, straining their aged muscles to the absolute breaking point, the husband and wife managed to use a fallen timber as a lever to roll the crushing beam away. They stood back, breathing heavily. Sitting in the exact center of the ruined chapel was a colossal altar carved from solid American white oak. It was over 8 feet long, 4 feet deep, and stained a deep, lustrous black by time and forgotten oils. Despite being exposed to decades of rain, snow, and suffocating debris, the wood was completely untouched by rot, mold, or termites. It was perfectly pristine. The sheer craftsmanship of the piece was breathtaking, a silent testament to an era when men built things to outlast their own grandchildren. The intricate carvings of wheat and water lilies along the front panels were as sharp as the day the chisel had left the wood. It stood there in the freezing ruins, completely unbothered, radiating an aura of quiet, unyielding defiance. The skeleton of this $4 ruin was stronger than any modern mansion. A profound sense of respect washed over Eleanor as she reached out to touch the cold, polished surface of the black oak. The bitterness of her son's betrayal faded into the background, replaced by a smoldering, quiet hope. This place was abandoned, abused, and left for dead by a world that no longer valued resilience. She knew exactly how that felt. This ruin was not dead, it was only sleeping, waiting to be awakened. And when Eleanor scraped away the green moss at the base of the altar, she noticed an anomaly that made her heartbeat stutter.
The first 3 weeks were a brutal masterclass in absolute human endurance. The temperature deep in Owsley County rarely climbed above 28 degrees Fahrenheit during the unforgiving daylight hours. Every single morning, long before the sun even attempted to bleed over the frozen Appalachian ridges, Eleanor and Silas crawled out of the freezing cab of their old Ford pickup truck. Their joints screamed in agony. Their fragile bones ached with a deep, penetrating cold that settled into their very marrow and absolutely refused to leave. But they did not complain. They did not utter a single word of self-pity or regret. They simply tightened their frayed canvas coats, pulled on their stiff work gloves, and walked quietly into the ruins of the stone chapel. The sheer volume of hazardous debris was completely staggering. Thousands of pounds of shattered slate tiles, rotting pine beams, and frozen earth choked the sanctuary floor. Eleanor attacked the mess with a terrifying, silent resolve. She did not have heavy earth-moving machinery. She did not have wheelbarrows or conveyor belts to ease her burden. She had nothing but a single, cracked 5-gallon plastic bucket. She dropped to her knees in the freezing dirt, scooping up handfuls of wet ash, broken glass, and decaying animal nests. Her bare hands cracked and bled inside her thin gloves, the dry skin splitting open from the relentless friction and the biting cold. She ignored the pain completely. She filled the heavy bucket, stood up on shaking legs, walked 50 yards to the edge of the property, and dumped the debris into a growing pile. She repeated this exact process hundreds of times a day. She became an unstoppable machine of pure, unyielding will, driven by a quiet dignity that refused to be broken. Silas focused entirely on the sky above them. The collapsed section of the roof left them completely exposed to the relentless Kentucky snowstorms. He dragged his battered body through the knee-deep snow, his ruined left leg dragging behind him like a heavy anchor of pure agony. He scoured the nearby woods for fallen oak and hickory branches, hauling pieces of frozen timber that weighed over 80 pounds back to the chapel. He did not have modern power saws or pneumatic nail guns. He had a rusty crosscut saw, a heavy iron framing hammer, and a rusted box of salvaged steel nails. He slowly climbed the treacherous ice-covered scaffolding they had pieced together from garbage, his crippled legs shaking violently under his own weight. He measured every single angle perfectly. He sawed through dense, frozen wood using nothing but the agonizing repetition of his shoulders and back. He drove 6-inch steel nails through the thick timber. The sharp cracks of his hammer rang out across the dead valley like gunfire. They worked for 14 hours a day, stopping only when it was entirely too dark to see the ground beneath their worn boots. They ate stale white bread and drank freezing water from a plastic jug. They were starving, exhausted, and completely broken by all logical standards. They did not stop. Their absolute silence was a beautiful, terrifying hymn of defiance. Hundreds of miles away in the city, their son Julian was sitting in a climate-controlled office overlooking a skyline of gleaming glass and steel. He was drinking $80 bottles of imported wine and checking the massive balance of the offshore accounts he had stolen from his own flesh and blood. He thought he had destroyed them entirely. He thought he had completely erased their legacy. He was incredibly foolish. He did not realize that true legacy is not kept in digital bank accounts or printed paper deeds. True legacy is built in the permanent calluses on a man's hands and the unbreakable titanium of a woman's spine. Eleanor and Silas were not dying in this desolate ruin. They were being reborn. The local people of Whispering Pines watched them from a distance. The townsfolk drove past the property in their warm, comfortable trucks, slowing down just to stare at the two old figures covered in soot and mud. They whispered about the crazy old couple who bought a pile of rocks for $4. They shook their heads in profound pity. No one stopped to help. The profound change finally began on the morning of the 18th day. The wind was howling down the valley, throwing sheets of freezing sleet against the limestone walls. Eleanor was dragging a massive section of rotting pew across the floor when a heavy shadow fell over the doorway. She stopped and looked up. Standing in the entrance was an old man, roughly 75 years of age, wearing a heavy canvas coat permanently covered with decades of dried mortar dust. He held a worn leather tool bag in his left hand. His name was Elias Thorne. He was a retired master stonemason, a proud man whose own grandfather had actually helped quarry the very limestone blocks that made up the walls of the chapel. He had been watching Eleanor and Silas for over 2 weeks, fully expecting them to quit after the first agonizing day. He had watched them bleed, freeze, and refuse to surrender. He did not say a single word at first. He walked slowly past Eleanor, his heavy leather boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. He approached the massive stone wall near the altar, ran his thick, scarred fingers over a deep crack in the mortar, and unzipped his leather bag. He pulled out a heavy steel trowel and a small plastic bucket of custom-mixed lime putty. "You're using the wrong angle on that roof brace," Elias finally said, his voice as rough and coarse as crushed gravel. Silas looked down from the freezing scaffolding, his breath pluming in the icy air. He did not take offense at the abrupt criticism. He simply nodded his head in quiet respect. "Come show me," Silas replied calmly. That was the entire exchange. There were no grand introductions, no pitiful tears, and absolutely no pathetic pleas for charity. Elias Thorne simply went to work. He spent the next 10 hours meticulously scraping away the dead, crumbling mortar from the limestone joints, replacing it with fresh, resilient lime putty. His old hands moved with a practiced, rhythmic grace, literally breathing life back into the dead stone. He did not ask for money. He did not ask for a warm meal or a cup of coffee. He worked until his fingers bled because he recognized the quiet, stoic dignity of two people fighting a brutal war against the entire world. He recognized his own kind. 3 days later, the sound of a rattling engine shattered the quiet afternoon. A rusted blue tow truck pulled onto the muddy path, its spinning tires kicking up slush and gravel. A young man hopped out of the cab. He was 22 years old, his young face perpetually smudged with dark motor oil, wearing a faded mechanic's jumpsuit. His name was Toby. He worked at the only auto repair shop in town, a miserable garage located 3 miles away on the edge of the county highway. He had seen the Vance's old Ford pickup truck parked outside the chapel night after freezing night. He knew exactly what it meant when a metal engine block stayed completely cold in 30-degree weather. He walked to the back of his tow truck and dropped the heavy steel tailgate. The truck bed was loaded with over 200 pounds of dry, perfectly seasoned hickory firewood. He also carried a large steaming aluminum thermos and 2 heavy foil-wrapped packages that radiated a heavenly, savory heat. Toby walked straight into the sanctuary, his heavy work boots hesitating on the freshly cleared granite floor. He set the thermos and the hot food down at the edge of the massive black oak altar.
"I had extra," Toby muttered nervously, looking down at his oil-stained boots to avoid their eyes. "The firewood was just taking up space at the shop, and my boss made way too much beef stew. You can throw it away if you want." He turned and practically ran back to his rumbling truck, desperate to avoid any awkward expressions of gratitude. Eleanor stopped shoveling dirt. She walked slowly over to the beautiful altar and carefully unwrapped the aluminum foil. Inside were thick, steaming slices of roasted meat, hot potatoes, and a massive thermos of scalding black coffee. She looked at the fresh pile of dry firewood Toby had quickly dumped near the entrance. A small, fiercely loyal community of strangers was forming around them in the freezing woods. The working-class people who had absolutely nothing were giving them everything, while the wealthy son who had everything had given them absolutely nothing. It was a profound, heartbreaking contrast that Eleanor locked away deep in her mind. By the end of the second month, the physical transformation of the chapel was nothing short of miraculous. The massive, gaping hole in the roof had been sealed completely with thick, overlapping sheets of reclaimed tin and heavy canvas tarps. The brutal winter wind could no longer penetrate the sanctuary. Elias had successfully tuck-pointed the entire interior wall, locking the massive blue limestone blocks together with fresh, unyielding mortar. Eleanor had scrubbed every single inch of the granite floor on her hands and knees. She had painstakingly removed 150 years of accumulated filth. The chapel was no longer a rotting corpse of stone and dead wood. It was a beautiful fortress. It was a sanctuary of survival, built entirely on a foundation of pure physical agony, calloused hands, and the quiet kindness of complete strangers. A massive iron stove, scavenged by Toby from a local junkyard, sat in the corner, radiating a glorious, life-saving heat. The temperature inside the chapel was finally well above freezing. Silas was working quietly near the massive black oak altar in the exact center of the room. He was attempting to pry away a heavily warped section of floorboard just a few inches from the heavy wooden base. He was using a massive crowbar forged from solid iron, a brutal, unforgiving tool that weighed at least 12 pounds. His tired grip suddenly faltered. Months of relentless exhaustion and bitter cold finally caught up to his aching muscles. His stiff fingers slipped against the smooth, freezing iron. The heavy iron crowbar slipped completely from his tired hands and fell straight down toward the solid granite floor. It did not hit the granite. It struck the edge of a massive, perfectly flat stone, resting immediately beneath the overhanging lip of the dark oak altar. The sound that bounced back was entirely wrong. It was not the sharp, bone-rattling crack of solid iron striking solid stone. It was a deep, terrifyingly resonant boom that echoed wildly up through the floorboards and vibrated violently against the freshly mortared walls. The sound hung heavy in the cold air. It was entirely hollow. The sweat and the kindness of strangers had brought these stones back to life, but on that quiet afternoon when Silas accidentally dropped his heavy iron crowbar against the base of the altar, the echoing sound that bounced back up from the floor was not the dull thud of solid rock, but the deep, resonant boom of a massive hidden void.
Silas dropped to his knees. He ignored the agonizing pain shooting up his ruined leg. He pressed his calloused hand flat against the freezing surface of the massive granite slab directly beneath the dark oak altar. He dragged his fingers across the rough stone, searching for the seam. He found it hidden beneath a century of compacted dirt and hardened lime. It was a perfect, deliberate rectangle. The slab was at least 3 feet wide and 6 feet long. It was not a natural piece of the foundation. It was a perfectly cut lid. He did not shout. He did not celebrate. He simply turned his head and looked toward the doorway where the old stonemason was packing up his tools. "Elias," Silas said, his voice entirely flat and calm, "bring your heaviest pry bars." Elias walked slowly over. He looked at the floor, looked at the heavy iron crowbar resting near the altar, and immediately understood. He dropped his leather bag, pulled out a massive wedge of forged steel, and knelt beside Silas. They did not exchange any excited chatter. They were working men. They spoke through the brutal geometry of leverage and sweat. They drove the steel wedges into the microscopic gap between the massive slab and the surrounding floor. They pushed. The stone did not move. It weighed well over 800 pounds. It had been sealed tight by the sheer weight of time and gravity. Eleanor quietly walked over, picked up a heavy wooden timber they had sawed earlier, and slid it under the base of the iron pry bar to create a stronger fulcrum. They tried again. The 3 elderly people threw their combined weight against the heavy steel tools. Their muscles burned, their joints popped. The freezing air filled with the heavy sound of their ragged breathing. A loud, violent crack echoed through the sanctuary. The heavy slab shifted exactly 2 inches. A sudden rush of incredibly cold, impossibly dry air pushed up from the darkness below. It did not smell like wet earth or decaying wood. It smelled exactly like old parchment, dried wax, and absolute, undisturbed silence. They wedged the timber deeper. They pushed again. The massive slab slowly tilted backward, groaning against the adjacent stones, until it finally flipped over with a deafening crash that shook the entire chapel. The void was open. Eleanor walked over to the makeshift workbench, picked up a heavy battery-powered lantern Toby had left for them, and brought it to the edge of the pit. She shined the bright white beam down into the dark earth. It was not a dirt hole. It was a meticulously constructed subterranean crypt. The walls were lined perfectly with red fire bricks, completely untouched by ground moisture. The floor of the small chamber was exactly 4 feet below the surface. Sitting directly in the center of the dry brick floor was a massive iron chest. It was black, heavy, and bound in thick strips of rusted steel. A heavy brass padlock, green with heavy oxidation, secured the thick latch. Forged in the center of the iron lid was a raised crest, a heavy shield flanked by 2 crossed pickaxes. It was the original pioneer crest of the very first family to settle the rugged valleys of Owsley County. "Grab the heavy ropes," Silas muttered quietly. It took them nearly an hour of agonizing, back-breaking effort to hoist the massive iron chest out of the deep crypt. It weighed at least 150 pounds. They dragged it across the granite floor, the heavy metal grinding violently against the stone until it rested directly in front of the warm iron stove. Silas did not hesitate. He raised his heavy framing hammer and brought it down violently against the green brass padlock. The old lock shattered into 3 jagged pieces. Eleanor reached out with her bruised, dirt-stained hands. She grabbed the heavy iron latch and slowly pushed the massive lid open. The rusted hinges screamed in protest, a harsh metallic wail that had not been heard since the American Civil War. The chest was entirely full. There was no silver, there was no gold, there were no useless shiny trinkets. Instead, the chest was packed to the brim with heavy bundles wrapped in thick, waterproof oilcloth. Eleanor carefully lifted the first bundle, unwrapped the dark canvas, and revealed a massive stack of thick, textured parchment. She held history in her hands. The papers were immaculate. They were original, unregistered bearer bonds from the Great Railroad expansion of the late 19th century. They were incredibly rare, holding their full matured value in pure legal tender. Beneath the bonds were bundles of handwritten letters, perfectly preserved, detailing the early establishment of the mining routes through the Appalachian Mountains. But the true treasure lay at the very bottom of the heavy iron chest. It was a single, massive sheet of heavy vellum, folded perfectly into a thick leather folio. Eleanor opened it carefully. The cursive handwriting was sprawling, elegant, and entirely legible. It was an original land grant, signed and executed before the county lines had ever been formally drawn by the modern state government. She read the words slowly, her mind absorbing the absolute, terrifying magnitude of what she was holding. It was a permanent, irrevocable deed of ownership for the subterranean mineral rights, covering exactly 2,000 acres of land. It explicitly included the massive untapped coal and limestone veins running directly beneath the entire town of Whispering Pines. The document possessed an unbroken chain of title, locked away in the dark before any modern corporation could steal it. It had never been sold, it had never been transferred. Because Eleanor had purchased the condemned chapel under a total and absolute tax deed, she now legally possessed every single asset permanently affixed to the original property lines. She did not just own a ruined building, she owned the earth itself. Far away in his towering glass office, Julian was furiously moving digital numbers on a glowing screen, believing he was a master of the universe because he had stolen $1 million from 2 exhausted bakers. He was playing a pathetic, shallow game. Eleanor sat quietly on the cold stone floor, holding the heavy vellum deed in her bleeding hands. She did not smile. She did not cheer. She simply stared at the heavy red wax seal at the bottom of the page, her face a mask of absolute, unyielding calm. Those were not just yellowed papers, they were the ultimate legal shield, and as Eleanor saw the red wax seal on the deed, she knew the hour of judgment had truly arrived.
Elias Thorne knew people. Before his retirement, he had restored historic courthouses across the entire state. He made a single phone call from a landline in town. A week later, a sleek black town car rolled slowly down the frozen, muddy expanse of Old Mill Road. It parked right next to the rusted 1998 Ford pickup truck. 3 men stepped out into the 30-degree Fahrenheit chill. They wore expensive wool overcoats and carried heavy leather briefcases. The lead appraiser, a man named Sterling, looked at the patched tin roof and the dirt-stained walls of the chapel with profound skepticism. He sighed heavily, his breath pluming in the freezing air, clearly regretting the 80-mile drive from the state capitol. He expected to find garbage. He expected the tragic delusions of desperate, senile old fools holding on to worthless scraps of wet paper. He found a fortress. The interior was warm, heated by the massive iron stove Toby had found. Eleanor sat calmly at a makeshift pine table. She wore a patched canvas sweater, her hands still wrapped in stained cloth bandages from moving thousands of pounds of debris. Resting perfectly in the center of the rough wooden table was the open iron chest. "Let us see what you have found, Mrs. Vance," Sterling said gently, snapping on a pair of white cotton gloves. He approached the table. He reached into the heavy iron box and carefully lifted the first bundle of oilcloth. He unfolded it. His professional, polite smile instantly vanished. The color drained completely from his face. His hands began to shake violently. He stared at the original 19th century bearer bonds. He meticulously examined the heavy watermarks, the faded iron gall ink, and the immaculate preservation of the parchment. He did not say a single word. He simply placed them down and picked up the massive leather folio at the bottom of the chest. He read the sprawling cursive of the ancient land grant. He read it again, his eyes wide with absolute shock. Sterling looked at the property lawyer standing beside him. The lawyer quickly pulled out the torn $4 tax deed Eleanor had received at the county courthouse. He ran his finger down the dense legal text, cross-referencing the lot numbers with the historical document. "It is absolute," the lawyer whispered in complete disbelief. "When you purchased this condemned structure, you purchased the original plat in its entirety. The county seized it under a tax forfeiture. You hold the absolute unencumbered title to the surface estate, the historical fixtures, and the subterranean mineral rights." Eleanor did not blink. Sterling carefully set the heavy vellum document back onto the rough pine table. He slowly took off his white cotton gloves. He looked at the quiet, tired woman sitting in front of him with a profound, terrified reverence. The contrast was staggering. Here was a woman covered in stone dust, living on $27, holding the absolute legal rights to a forgotten empire. "Mrs. Vance," Sterling said, his voice trembling slightly, "the matured historical bonds alone are worth an absolute fortune at auction, but the mineral rights, the untouched limestone and coal beneath this 2,000-acre valley, that is something else entirely." He stopped to catch his breath. "The total conservative valuation is $4,800,000. The number hung heavily in the warm air of the chapel. $4,800,000. It was an astronomical fortune pulled directly from a rotting hole in the ground that the entire world had discarded as absolute trash. It was a staggering validation of their agonizing, silent labor. Eleanor did not gasp. She did not cry tears of joy, and she certainly did not dance across the granite floor. She maintained her absolute, terrifying dignity. She simply looked across the room at her husband.
Silas stood near the altar, leaning quietly on his wooden cane, a faint, deeply satisfied smile resting in his eyes. Eleanor turned back to the trembling men in their expensive suits. "Would you gentlemen care for a cup of hot coffee before your long drive back?" Eleanor asked politely, her voice as steady as the limestone walls surrounding them. News of a massive fortune unearthed from a $4 garbage pile quickly spread across the state papers, and naturally it reached the ears of a man sitting on a mountain of debt.
The heavy tires of the $90,000 imported luxury vehicle crushed the frozen gravel of Old Mill Road. It was a massive, pristine black SUV. It looked completely absurd against the desolate, rotting backdrop of the deep Kentucky woods. Julian Vance gripped the leather steering wheel tightly, a sickeningly confident smirk plastered across his perfectly shaved face. Beside him, Beatrice adjusted her thick cashmere coat, complaining bitterly about the lack of cellular service in the freezing valley. They parked right next to the rusted 1998 Ford pickup truck. Julian stepped out into the biting 28-degree Fahrenheit air. His expensive Italian leather loafers immediately sank into the wet, freezing mud. He cursed quietly, kicking the dirt from his shoes, completely oblivious to the sacred ground he was standing on. He did not see the agonizing labor that had rebuilt the towering blue limestone walls. He only saw dollar signs. He only saw $4,800,000. He pushed open the heavy oak door. The interior of the chapel was incredibly warm, radiating a deep, comforting heat from the massive iron stove in the corner. Eleanor sat at the rough pine table. She wore her patched canvas coat. She held a small, incredibly sharp paring knife in her right hand. She was slowly, meticulously peeling a bright red apple. The long, unbroken ribbon of skin fell gracefully onto the wooden table. She did not look up when the heavy door slammed shut. She did not flinch at the intrusion. Silas stood by the dark oak altar, resting both calloused hands on his heavy wooden cane. He was entirely silent. "Mother?" Julian said smoothly, his voice dripping with a sickening, manufactured affection. "We were so incredibly worried about you two living out here in this hazardous squalor." Eleanor continued to peel the apple. "Family needs to take care of family. We came to bring you home." It was a stunning display of absolute, unadulterated hypocrisy. Julian stepped closer to the table, his greedy eyes scanning the room, desperately searching for the iron chest or the historical documents. "You found something very valuable, Mother. That is wonderful news. But you are not equipped to handle a multi-million-dollar asset liquidation. The tax liabilities alone would absolutely ruin you. Luckily, my legal authority still stands. I can manage the sale of the mineral rights for you. I will ensure you are comfortable." He reached inside his tailored wool coat. He pulled out a crisp, folded legal document. It was the original, comprehensive power of attorney he had used to steal their bakeries. He placed it firmly on the wooden table, right next to the red apple peel. "If you refuse to cooperate, the state will deem you mentally unfit to manage such a complex estate. I will have this entire structure seized by sunset. Do not make this difficult for yourselves. Sign the transfer papers right now." Eleanor finished peeling the apple. She gently set the sharp knife down on the wooden table. She picked up a clean white cloth and slowly wiped the sticky juice from her heavily scarred, calloused fingers. She looked directly into her son's eyes. Her gaze was not angry, it was not bitter, it was completely, terrifyingly hollow, like looking into a deep, frozen well. "You have absolutely no authority here," Eleanor said softly, her voice carrying an unshakable, terrifying weight. Julian laughed bitterly. "I have absolute legal authority, Mother. I own your names." "You own the names on your fabricated papers," a new voice echoed loudly from the deep shadows near the back of the sanctuary. Julian spun around violently. Stepping out from the heavy darkness behind the massive oak altar were two men. One was Sterling, the impeccably dressed property lawyer who had appraised the massive treasure just days before.
The second man wore a heavy brown uniform, a bright silver badge gleaming brightly on his broad chest. It was the county sheriff of Owsley County, a man who had zero tolerance for arrogant corporate thieves invading his jurisdiction. "What is this?" Julian demanded loudly, his voice cracking with sudden, overwhelming panic. "I am the legal conservator of this estate." Sterling calmly opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal filings. "You are the conservator of the Vance family enterprise, a completely defunct entity," Sterling explained patiently, his tone dripping with profound professional disdain. However, the $4 tax deed for this chapel was not purchased under that old name. When Mrs. Vance walked into the courthouse 2 months ago, she established an entirely new legal entity. It is called the Whispering Pines Independent Trust. She is the sole irrevocable beneficiary. Your piece of paper is completely worthless here. Julian stared at the lawyer, his jaw dropping in absolute horror. He was trapped. Furthermore, Sterling continued, his voice growing sharper, cutting through the warm air like a steel blade. Mrs. Vance authorized a very small cash advance against the matured historical bearer bonds. We did not buy luxury cars or expensive clothes. We hired a massive team of federal forensic accountants. They spent the last 72 hours tracking every single wire transfer you executed when you liquidated those bakeries. The blood completely drained from Julian's perfectly shaved face. He stumbled backward, his expensive shoes slipping slightly on the smooth granite floor. "They found the offshore accounts," the sheriff stated bluntly, stepping forward with a heavy steel handcuffs hanging loosely from his leather belt. "They found the fraudulent tax returns. You stole $1.4 million from elderly citizens through deliberate misrepresentation and interstate wire fraud. That is a massive federal felony." "No!" Beatrice screamed shrilly, desperately grabbing her husband's arm. "You cannot do this to us. We are wealthy. We have very expensive lawyers." "You have absolutely nothing," Eleanor said quietly. It was the very first time she had spoken to them since the day she was thrown out into the freezing sleet. She stood up slowly from the rough pine table. She looked at the pathetic, trembling boy she had raised, watching his arrogant facade completely shatter into a million jagged pieces. "You took our bakery. You took our home. You took 45 years of our blood and our sweat," Eleanor said, her voice perfectly even, completely devoid of any screaming or tears. "You thought we were weak because we worked with our hands, but hands that build things from the dirt are much stronger than hands that only know how to steal." The sheriff grabbed Julian roughly by the shoulder. He twisted the younger man's arms violently behind his back, the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut with a loud, absolute finality. The sharp metallic clicks echoed beautifully off the solid blue limestone walls. Julian did not fight back. He sobbed loudly, a pathetic weeping mess of a man, begging his mother for forgiveness as the sheriff dragged him forcefully toward the heavy oak door. Beatrice followed closely behind them, wailing hysterically, her expensive designer coat dragging pathetically through the wet ash and mud. Eleanor did not offer a single word of comfort. She did not shed a single tear for the son who had tried to bury her. She watched them drag him away, her posture incredibly rigid, maintaining an aura of absolute, crushing dignity. She had not lifted a single violent finger to destroy him. She had simply let the absolute, terrifying weight of the truth crush him down into the dirt. Watching the police car take her treacherous son away behind the winter trees, Eleanor gently closed the heavy oak door, leaving the darkness behind to step into a brilliant light. 6 months passed. The brutal Kentucky winter completely surrendered to a vibrant golden spring. The temperature in the valley held at a perfect 72 degrees Fahrenheit. The condemned structure on Old Mill Road was no longer a ruin. It was a magnificent stone estate. The massive blue limestone walls, originally built over 150 years ago, stood incredibly tall and proud. The The gaping hole in the roof had been perfectly replaced with heavy, dark slate shingles. New stained glass windows caught the late afternoon sun, casting beautiful, fractured pools of ruby and amber light across the flawlessly clean granite floor. It was breathtaking. Inside the warm sanctuary, the air smelled heavily of fresh sawdust and brewing tea. Silas stood by a massive workbench, resting near the ancient dark oak altar. He leaned comfortably on his wooden cane. Next to him stood Toby. The young mechanic was no longer covered in dark motor oil. He wore a clean canvas apron. Silas was patiently guiding the boy's hands, teaching him how to properly drive a heavy steel chisel through a thick block of solid ash wood. They were building something that would last. Out on the sweeping front porch, Elias Thorne sat in a heavy wooden rocking chair. He slowly sipped from a porcelain mug of hot tea, watching the wind roll gently through the massive valley. He did not have to haul heavy buckets of freezing mortar anymore. He was resting. He was family. Eleanor stood quietly by the massive arched window. She wore a simple, clean linen dress. The heavy canvas coat and the blood-stained bandages were gone, replaced by a quiet, radiant peace. She looked out over the 2,000 acres of rolling hills and deep forests that completely belonged to her. She had not hoarded the $4,800,000. She had immediately established the Whispering Pines Vocational Trust. It was a massive financial foundation dedicated entirely to teaching young men and women in the county how to be carpenters, masons, and mechanics. She was pouring her incredible fortune back into the calloused hands of the working class. She was building a solid future for the people who had brought them dry firewood and hot soup when they had absolutely nothing. They had bought an absolute empire for exactly $4. Eleanor understood the ultimate truth of the world. The true value of a human being or a towering historic building is never determined by how the shallow world prices it when it is broken, abandoned, and left to rot in the freezing dirt. True value is absolute. It lies completely in the quiet, terrifying strength to endure the brutal, agonizing chiseling of time. It lies in the stoic refusal to surrender when the roof caves in and the entire world laughs at your pain. Most importantly, it lies in the capacity to remain incredibly kind when you are trapped at the very bottom of the blackest abyss. Eleanor and Silas had lost absolutely everything, only to unearth a legacy that would outlast the mountains themselves. You see, the heavy wheel of karma always turns incredibly slowly, but it never forgets a single soul.